red. Final existence phase. 7. Yellow. Contraction phase. Billy says thanks. This information will please him. But now, again something else, as one knows, the mountains on Earth are still growing, but at the same time, erosion also takes place. An amateur geologist asked me as to what mountain on Earth has the greatest and fastest growth and, at the same time, the greatest erosion. And since you also occupy yourself with geology, and indeed even in an earthly relation, as you said, you should actually be able to answer this question, right? Quetzal says that is correct. To answer the question isn't a problem. This is the Nanga Parbat mountain in Pakistan, which belongs to the Himalayan mountains and to the 8000ers. Billy says then that would also be clear. So thus the next question, namely about Atlantis. If I remember correctly, Semyaza once said that there hadn't been only two Atlantises, the Great Atlantis and the Small Atlantis. Do you know about this? Quetzal says yes. There were 4 different Atlantises, so the new Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, between the Azores and Spain. Then there was the small Atlantis that existed in the Mediterranean Sea in the area of Santorini, and then Old Atlantis is to be mentioned, on which later, after its downfall, Troy was built, while Great Atlantis had its existence in the Atlantic. The Atlantines of Great Atlantis were the rulers over all 4 Atlantises and their peoples, for they all belonged to the same origin. Thus, a central government was given, but the administration of the various Atlantises took place through authorized representatives, who were called the lieutenant. Billy says then soon, I will have asked all questions. So still this months ago, a young man was with me, who had severe psychological problems that arose from sexual conduct during his childhood, and to be sure, by a pedophile Catholic priest. The man hesitated for a long time about the story before he told it to me. And quite obviously, he was very seriously burdened by his experiences with the priest, but out of shame and anxiety, he couldn't talk to anyone for over 17 years about what had naturally burdened his psyche, by what means he became more and more closed and isolated. Thus, I had the greatest difficulty in assuring him that he could trust me and that I could surely give him some good advice. But the whole thing lasted for 4 hours, before he was finally ready for speak. Quetzal says, excuse me for interrupting you, but wouldn't one correctly say to speak instead of for speak? Billy says, of course, then have I said for instead of to? Quetzal says that you have. Translator's note: I believe this marks the first instance in all of the contact reports that I've translated so far, which is over 90 at the time of writing this note, where someone in the report has said something that is grammatically incorrect, though this case represents an extremely minor one. In the original German language, Meier said zum instead of zur, which makes the mistake even more understandable than it might seem in my English translation. I was beginning to wonder if Meier or one of the Sirians could ever make a grammatical mistake while speaking. One would think that if these reports contain nothing but the verbatim dialogue of unrehearsed conversations, then they would contain numerous slips of the tongue and other errors in speaking all throughout. The fact that they don't might cause one to wonder if they have been revised and/or edited before publication. Of course, the other possibility is that those who are speaking are masters of controlling and speaking their own language and almost always speak properly, no matter what the situation may be. If the latter is true, it certainly says a lot about the intelligence of those who are conversing. Of course, it's also important to note that the fact that such a mistake is recorded and presented in the conversation helps to speak against the first possibility. Whatever the reason for the lack of grammatical errors may be, I'm thankful that almost all of the sentences are grammatically correct, for it makes my task a whole lot easier. Billy says then I've made a slip. Please check the mistake for me. Now, it turned out, then, that the priest mentioned by him is known to me. Moreover, it concerns a man who is already older now, to whom I will read the riot act with opportunity. But what I really want to say is that the young man, after he had expressed himself to me and had told me the whole story, feels changed and liberated since then, and indeed, continuously, as he even told me last night on the telephone. Quite obviously, he could free himself from his age-old burden through the conversation with me and now leads a reasonable and carefree life, liberated from the old burden. The question now is whether you can take me to this priest, so that I can take him to task. You know that, because of my health, I can't go by train, and I don't want someone to take me there by car, for one would have to ask me for the reason behind the visit with the priest, and I would have to give an untruthful answer, which doesn't lie within me, however. Moreover, one would then also know where the priest exercises his office. Quetzal says I can meet your wish. We will still talk about that. Of course, it is good if you are silent over the name of the priest as well as over the place where he holds his office. But one thing you should be aware of regarding the pedophilic sexual abuse of the priest is that this isn't an isolated case, for among the Catholic priests, pedophilia is widely spread, which is due, not in the least, to celibacy. In the main form, homosexual offences appear in this respect. And in fact, there are thousands of Catholic priests throughout the world, who violate children and adolescents in a pedophilic manner. An evil that will run more and more rampant in the coming time, and indeed not just with Catholic priests but also with the teachers of schools and sports, as well as in child pornography and child prostitution, and even with many parents who sexually abuse their children. In the coming time, it will all take on ever greater and worse proportions, which, on the one hand, is due to the fact that through Beatus, the sexual taboo became destroyed, which led to the fact that worldwide, open prostitution and pornography can be publicly operated in many forms, without punitive measures being taken against it, which will lead in the coming time to blatant degeneracy, and on the other hand, this also traces back to the machinations of Beatus, whereby all morals in reference to sexuality become violated, which will still worsen in the coming years and decades, by what means practically the entire world will become a cesspool of sexual degeneracy, and this will be tolerated by the authorities of the governments because many of them will be involved in these machinations themselves in a profit-winning or vice-fulfilling way. Of course, there will only be a few who will be called to account, while the majority of all fallible ones can pursue and indulge in their criminal, immoral, and degenerate sexual machinations undisturbed. And also included in the majority of the offending perpetrators are all those who somehow advocate, contribute to, or who are even the beneficiaries of the machinations. Therefore, also included therein are all those who involve themselves in these machinations, directly or indirectly. Billy says well said, and it especially has the last word in itself, in order to describe the matter. Then I now have just 3 questions. The climate change that is going on and that should progress more and more rapidly in the coming years, as you mentioned at another time, this is very well due, in part, to the senselessness of human beings with their environmental pollution, air pollution, land degradation, water degradation and, in general, the overall environmental degradation in every respect. Of course, we've already talked about this often, but I am still asked the same questions over and over again. All the coming events in the upcoming years and decades, which are teeming with natural disasters of all kinds and which will demand many human lives and cause enormous devastation, also trace back, however, to quite natural causes, as these have already been given by nature and cosmic influences for millions of years. Am I right in my acceptance that already for quite some time and in the near and more distant future, everything related to this can approximately be divided by 2, that even about 50% is of natural origin and about 50% is of unreasonable, destructive human origin? Quetzal says that is correct. The ratio is to be regarded approximately in this measure. Billy says you said something about the ice at the poles, namely what percent of the ice at the poles will have melted by the year 2000, etc. Quetzal says that is correct. I remember that. The explanation was that by the year 2000, through the climate change